The new journal is here, Battle for Tallarn Part 1. Let's learn about the planet and its demise. Let's recreate one of the most infamous battles, Row 1819, in one of the newest missions. Let's look at running Armoured Spearhead detachments with some of the new units. And let's also explore the new Mechanicum cohort Vargas, which allows us to play Automata in several different ways. Let's discover this together. Imagine a planet of endless oceans and sapphire skies, home to billions living in tranquil peace, erased in a single heartbeat. Perturabo and the Iron Warriors destroyed it utterly. Paradise transformed into a rotting toxic tomb, laid to waste by mutagenic viral payloads. But why? Why destroy a fertile, beautiful planet? A planet of no strategic value? Perturabo was hunting. Deep beneath the soil lay an ancient dark secret, the Cursus. After the bombs, the surface of the planet became a violent, hellish and highly corrosive nightmare. If you stepped outside in a standard respirator or void suit, the air would melt through your gear in moments, dissolving your lungs before you could even scream. Flesh was a liability. Only vehicles could operate effectively. For weeks, Iron Warrior commanders roamed the planet, acting like apocalyptic warlords, scouring the ruins for the Cursus. But then, everything changed. Out of the subterranean shelters came a force the 4th Legion never expected, the Tallarn Reborn. The core leadership comprised grizzled veterans of the Cinderborn cohort of the Solar Auxilia. Under the command of former cohort marshal Jasara Sanavel, these veterans instilled a sense of imperial duty amongst the survivors. They united remnant forces from parent regiments left behind during the Great Crusade, including the Journeyan Alcatrana and the Cossack Highborn, as well as brave civilian volunteers. These experienced veterans managed vast weapon stocks in the underground shelters and drilled all those physically capable. When they finally launched their uprising, they were reborn as the Sapphire Ghosts and the Ithak Nur. And they weren't alone. Soon, loyalist splinter forces arrived to aid them. This brings us to the first major engagement between the Iron Warriors Scorn 2-6 and the resurgent Solar Auxilia forces. The infamous ambush at Row 1819. The Iron Warriors, bored of weeks without any engagement and arrogant in their dominance, were lulled into a catastrophic trap. The Tallarn Reborn sprung their ambush. A Militaris-grade purpose-built explosive launched 2 Vindicator tanks 20 metres into the air. The Solar Auxilia defenders made use of otherwise wrecked Leman Russ tanks, the hulls of which were already compromised. The defenders would man their posts for mere moments before the atmosphere ate through their suits and they succumbed to the toxic environment, only to be replaced by another defender to continue the attack. A brutal engagement ensued, the Iron Warriors putting up a stoic defence, but even their reinforcements were unable to save the ambushed column. With an Iron Hands Thunderhawk gunship and Xiphon fighters screaming through the toxic skies, blunting the Iron Warriors' advance and allowing the heroic defenders to withdraw and fight another day. The Tallarn Journal has a specific scenario where players can recreate Row 1819 on the tabletop, where the attacking Iron Warriors don't know what tanks are destroyed and what might be a threat. And on the face of it, it looks like a real tense game. There's also new rules on how to run an Armoured Spearhead detachment, as well as 2 further missions called Clash of Irons and Reconnaissance in Force. And if you're thinking of running an Armoured Spearhead army, here's how. Rule number 1, you must always select more units with a vehicle unit type than any other unit in your army, which is fair enough. The book introduces 2 new command tanks, which you can take as part of an Armoured Spearhead detachment. A Dracosan command tank for Solar Auxilia and a Spartan Prometheus command tank for Legion Space Marines, both of which occupy a high command slot. The journal also introduces a brand new Apex detachment, which is an armoured command squadron, which is a single Apex detachment comprising 3 armour slots. These slots can be occupied by Predators, Arquiters, and they unlock 2 prime benefits. The first is the hardened systems, which allows your designated unit to attempt to repair itself at both the start and the end of the effects phase. And as we all know, removing statuses at the start of a turn can completely change the game. If you know you're going to be playing against a Mechanicum list, for example, hardened systems is incredibly beneficial for keeping those vehicles operational. As my good buddy Andy knows, statuses can ruin your Kratos' day. The second option is suspension web stabilizers, which means the unit is always counted as being stationary for the purposes of heavy X special rule. On paper, this honestly feels like the stronger, more versatile option because it lets you stay on the move while keeping your firing efficiency at an absolute maximum. Weapons like the Predator cannon, all autocannon variants and heavy bolters instantly benefit from additional shot whilst moving. If you're running conversion beamers, these can move and still benefit from additional point of strength. But who are the biggest winners here? I personally think it's the Arquita with the Graviton charge cannon. They only have a 24-inch range with a strength 9 AP3, which is nice, large blast, breaching 6 up and pinning template. But because you count as stationary and they have heavy D, this means they gain damage 3, which is pretty mega. And I do expect to see a lot of those in the wild. Now, if you're planning to play the Armoured Spearhead missions, which are designed specifically for Armoured Spearhead detachments, Clash of Iron and Reconnaissance and Force, the victory points are calculated completely differently depending on essentially what is destroyed. For all intents and purposes, it is kill points, but with a twist. If a vehicle destroys a vehicle, your victory points are split into 3 distinct categories based on how the target dies. Clean kill. This is a jackpot. You reduce a model to 0 hull points with a penetrating hit, but it doesn't explode. Just a straight up clean execution, 5 victory points. The second is total loss. You reduce a vehicle to 0 hull points via penetrating or glancing hit, but the vehicle does explode. Ironically, you only score 3 victory points, which is strange. Making a tank dramatically blow up actually nets you fewer points. Worthless Hulk. This is the third way of scoring victory points. The model is destroyed entirely by glancing hits, scoring you 2 victory points. Owing to the way glances and penetration now works in 3.0, in my mind you're always going to be pushing for the pens to be calculated at the right time. Otherwise you can lose out on quite a significant amount of victory points, which may prove difficult in a competitive setting. Thankfully, we all play narrative. But what happens if a non-vehicle destroys a vehicle? Say a infantry squad manages to destroy a vehicle. That is classified as a collateral kill and scores you a flat 1 victory point. The big target exception, however, is that non-vehicle units managing to bring down a vehicle with 8 or more hull points will score you an additional 2 victory points. Whereas if they take down a super heavy vehicle or a knight, you grab an additional 3 victory points. Something which does strike me as a little strange is that if a vehicle manages to remove the last hull point from, say, a super heavy, which can explode on a 4+, it's a 50-50 as to whether the unit will explode. Therefore, the player might score 3 or 5 victory points. However, if a non-vehicle unit were to remove the last hull point from a super heavy, irrespective of whether the super heavy explodes, they score a flat 4 victory points. I'll leave that with you guys. Finally, let's talk about the environment itself. So the Tallarn Journal introduces necrotic annihilation as a new toxic environmental rule, which is effectively treated as area terrain that models move in, through or out of, similar to difficult terrain. For infantry, any model within these areas must take a toughness test. If they fail, they immediately suffer a strength 4 AP2 damage 1 wound. Given the absence of invulnerable and feel no pain saves in 3rd edition, this is brutal for basic Space Marines and Solar Auxilia. But here's the kicker: whether your infantry takes damage or not, they always take a stun status, meaning they're unable to make reactions. So entering these contaminated areas literally paralyzes your tactical options. However, vehicles aren't safe either. If a vehicle has already lost 1 or more hull points and finds itself within an area of necrotic annihilation, it automatically suffers a glancing hit, and then presumably you'll be rolling to see exactly what status the unit suffers next. Moving on to the new units, starting with the new Mechanicum cohort, Vegas Iterant cohorts. This has really got my mojo flowing, even though I can't actually pronounce what they're called. Many of the great battlefields of the Horus Heresy, Tallarn, Kelth, Paramar, Betagarman, and others, were infested by such wandering cohorts, the worn machines apt to stumble from the waste to attack any force, their corruptic logic identified as foe. Many an engagement were decided by the intervention of such a force, and many commanders could relate tales of how defeat was turned to victory by the appearance of help unlooked for. The Cohort Vegas detachment is treated as an additional detachment to a primary detachment in games of over 1500 points, as a way of introducing automata to your army. However, it is also possible to use the Vegas cohort as your primary detachment in games of 1500 points or less. More of that in just a moment. As an additional detachment, the Cohort Vargas may only be filled with Castellax, Destructor and Battle Maniples, Vorax, Thanatar, Voltarax and Domitars. The whole detachment selects one of 4 new prime advantages, but must be all the same, so there's no picking and choosing. Lastly, the Cybernetica trait is replaced with Vargas. It's also worthwhile emphasising that all units within a Vargas detachment gain Cortex Corruption, which means they may not be joined by other models and may not benefit from Cybertheurgy, which may seem a huge disadvantage, but wait until we go through the new prime advantages. In addition, all of the units become expendable 1, meaning your opponent scores 1 less victory point for scoring Vanguard or First Strike, making their loss a lot less painful. Crucially for mech players, however, it doesn't state that they can't benefit from Battlesmith, which is really important. Now, what are the new Vargas prime advantages? These are Battlefield Orphans, Misplaced Reinforcements, Corrupted Programming, and Malign Influence. Let's start with Battlefield Orphans. These are wandering remnants of a once larger force, appearing without warning only to vanish at the end of battle. So in addition to having Cortex Corruption and Expendable 1, the unit may increase its base ballistic skill and weapon skill by +1 to a maximum of 4, however, its toughness is reduced by 1. And then at the end of the game, the unit is removed as casualties. In my mind, this is perfect for most automata, and I can see this being quite popular, being able to improve ballistic skill and weapon skill when most of these units are native toughness 5 or more. It also takes out the hassle of needing to roll for Cybertheurgy to improve ballistic skill and weapon skill, at risk of taking more wounds in subsequent phases owing to Cybertheurgic feedback. Note, however, at the end of the game, all models in the prime slot are removed as casualties, which may factor into games where there's kill points at stake. Next up is Misplaced Reinforcements, which are a forgotten force slowly reawoken and deployed to the battlefield. Once again, these units gain Cortex Corruption and Expendable 1, however, they get Infiltrate 9. Now interestingly, if the unit is set up more than 12 inches from an enemy unit, then the models in the unit start with 1 less wound, which does seem a little bit harsh, but remember, we can still use Battlesmith to regain those wounds on automata. Secondly, when deployed, the unit's ballistic skill and weapon skill are reduced to 2. However, at the start of each turn, they gain additional ballistic skill and weapon skill to a maximum of 4. I quite like the slow progression of the units as they awaken from their deep slumber, and being able to introduce a detachment with high manoeuvrability, a distraction carnifex if you were, creates a really fun and interesting dynamic for people to explore. Most units would benefit from only being 9 inches from the enemy turn 1, and whilst they're unable to charge turn 1 as they infiltrated, and they wouldn't be able to benefit from Firestorm, for example, from turn 2 they would be able to lean into essentially one of their biggest strengths, unleashing lots of firepower, and most of the automata units have the toughness and resilience to take any incoming fire, and they'll be able to endure for turns 2 onwards. Corrupted programming. Survivors of a terrible massacre, logic corrupted, the automata draping themselves in the remains of the dead. Hello, Night Lords. Ironically, this is traitor behaviour, however, a loyalist army can choose to take this prime advantage. Once again forced to take Corrupted Cortex and Expendable 1, they gain Fear 1, which is huge for Mechanicum when you consider all of the statuses that they can dish out. And they also gain Explodes 4 up, which is just good old-fashioned fun. In addition, if these units are not locked in combat during both players' assault phases, the unit takes cyberthergic feedback, which means each modern unit must make an armor save. I think this is absolutely worth it. Taking some Castellax, marching them up the table with their 6 wounds, 3 up armor save with a 12-inch fear bubble, yes please. Even Vorax or a Voltrax with better movement would work just as well. However, remember to keep a Magos or Tech Priest nearby to repair those lost wounds, as they will take damage from taking cyberthergic feedback. Lastly, Malign Influence. These units have managed to tamper with their Cortex controller and become relentless, tireless weapons. It sounds very much like Shrike from Mortal Engines. In addition to the aforementioned, these units gain hatred to anything that does not have the Automata unit type, meaning they gain +1 to wound in combat. If these units have not made an attack during the shooting or assault phase, the unit suffers cyberthergic feedback. Now here's the kicker. These units are able to shoot friendly units, which is hilarious. So you could opt to shoot your own unit to avoid taking feedback. I really like the idea of this one. Theme-wise, it's probably one of the strongest. However, most automata have high strength anyway, therefore gaining an additional +1 to wound is largely immaterial and situational at best. In my mind, having something like impact attacks would have a significantly bigger impact. Vorax are probably the weakest unit with only strength 5, therefore they might benefit the most from this prime advantage. I also mentioned that it's possible to take a Vargas cohort as a primary detachment in games of 1500 points or less. This again is very, very interesting. So there's no command slots, therefore you have to lean fully into the cohort. However, it does say you may take an allied detachment, which is really fun. In these smaller point games, victory points are scored slightly differently for the cohort. So once per game turn, the controlling player may score 1 victory point for removing a non-line unit and 2 victory points for a line unit, meaning it would be able to score a maximum of 3 victory points per turn, which on paper looks to be really balanced and let you play the detachment in the spirit it was intended. I really like how these sound, and I'm going to enjoy leaning into different prime advantages as part of smaller and larger games. I think the best thing is they've considered several different ways of running automata, and the new detachments can be easily integrated into existing forces and legions. Moving on to the new units and starting with the Tracrosan and Spartan command tanks. Notably, these are high command choices. They both have Tank Commander 2, meaning they can select 2 armoured auxiliary detachment, or Armoured Tertio for Solar, and both are command vehicles, meaning they can be used for leadership and cool checks from Voxes once per turn. Interestingly, only the Spartan has a transport capacity which has been significantly reduced to a maximum of 8, and may only be occupied by a unit comprising 1 or more command models. And whilst there is an argument for, historically speaking, that a command tank would not be expected to go toe-to-toe with the big guns or be at the front of a massive attack, it's still forced to get into the thick of it, and it's a 420 point transport unit that can only carry 8 models. Secondly, it only has access to 2 Gravis heavy bolters, which are good weapons in themselves at 8 shots each, suppressive 2, at ballistic skill 5, but seems to be wasted in an armoured warfare environment. And I suspect players would probably opt for better priced units. We've also seen the Mole Mortar reintroduced to Solar Auxilia, and it's a really cool weapon with a completely new way of working. A single rapier is 30 points with a 36-inch range, firepower 2, range strength 7, AP 3 and damage 2. However, it's heavy D, making it damage 3 when stationary. It's also barrage 0, which is really important, Armorbane pinning 1 and has the subterranean special rule. Being barrage 0 is very unique, meaning it hits the side armour of vehicles, but it doesn't scatter. You just roll to hit. A unit of 3 mil mortars would put out 6 shots, hitting on 4s, looking for 4s to penetrate the side armour of a Rhino, owing to Armorbane, and they should easily remove 6 hull points per round of shooting. The subterranean rule does make sense, whereby no cover or shroud mitigation saves can be taken. It obviously can't hit flyers, and you can only affect models on the lowest level of a building. That all makes sense. I do hope to see more of these in the wild, as they look really cool, but they're also super effective. Lastly, we've seen updated rules for the Charonite Ogryns. 3 will cost you 120 points, but you can add an additional 6 at 40 points per model. Movement 7, so they are quick. Weapon skill 4, ballistic skill 2, strength and toughness 5, 4 wounds, initiative 2 and 4 attacks. Their leadership 12, cool 10 with a 4-up save. But when you factor in they've got a 5-up feel no pain, they get impact attacks, so that's 5 on the charge, combined with Charonite Claws, strength 7, AP 3, damage 2, reaching 5 up. These guys will do work, especially in Zone Mortalis. In summary, this is a great journal and adds extra layers in different ways. I'm motivated to explore doing a full-on Solar Auxilia tank regiment. However, my biggest gripe is not all factions benefited from a command tank equivalent and feels a little bit drip-fed. I mean, the clue is in the name. It's Tallarn Journal Part 1, and it is the downloadable content approach, which is a personal annoyance of mine. In my mind, expansions should be well-rounded and considered. You know, we got this back in the 1990s with Space Hulk, Necromunda and Gorka Morka, and gave us, leaps forward in new directions. That said, in my mind, the Vargas cohorts are the biggest winners. 2 pages of awesome rules and ways of playing existing models differently. And again, I can't wait to see what people do with these in the wild. But what do you think of the journal? Would your legion survive the acid sands of Tallarn? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe for more heresy lore and tabletop breakdowns. And until next time, beep boop, out. The Casas! Including the Journeyan Alcatrana. The Casas! With an Iron Hands Thunderfork gut. This is so cool.